Imagine for a moment. The entire known world, everything you have ever known, doubles overnight. New continents, new peoples, new plants, new animals, new ideas, and new dangers appear out of nowhere. What if I told you that this is exactly what happened? That the story we think we know about the discovery of America, the story of 3 small ships and 1 brave explorer, was only the first whisper in a hurricane that would change the world forever. This is not just the story of a discovery. It is the story of a collision that redefined humanity. Before we dive deep into this transformative era, a short question for you. What time are you watching this video right now? Write it in the comments. It is fascinating to see when and where in the world our stories are being heard. To understand the monumental significance of the events at the end of the 15th century, we must first understand the world as it was then. In truth, there were 2 worlds, separated by a vast ocean. Each one complete, complex, and completely unaware of the existence of the other. Let us begin in Europe. The late 15th century was a time of upheaval, ferment, and unrestrained ambition. The Middle Ages were coming to an end, and the first bright rays of the Renaissance were spreading across the continent. A new way of thinking began to spread, a way of thinking that placed man and his abilities at the center. Scholars once again studied the ancient texts of the Greeks and Romans. Artists created works of unprecedented vividness, and inventors worked on machines that were meant to push the limits of what was possible. But Europe was also a continent full of conflicts and constraints. In the middle of the century, the Ottoman Empire had conquered Constantinople, once the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. With this fall, the legendary Silk Road, which for centuries had been the most important trade route for spices, silk, and other precious goods from the Far East, became unsafe and extremely costly. Spices such as pepper, nutmeg, and cloves were not only luxury items in Europe at that time. They were of strategic importance. They were used to preserve food, to make medicine, and they were a status symbol for the rich and powerful. Whoever controlled the spice trade controlled immense wealth. The European powers, above all Portugal and Spain, were feverishly searching for an alternative route to India and the Spice Islands. The Portuguese were the pioneers of this search. Under the patronage of Henry the Navigator, they had already spent decades slowly but steadily exploring down the coast of Africa. They perfected their shipbuilding technology and their navigation skills. The result was the caravel, a type of ship that was suited to voyages of discovery like no other. It was small, maneuverable, and, thanks to its lateen sails, could also sail against the wind. Equipped with instruments such as the astrolabe and the compass, sailors could determine their position on the open sea with an accuracy that was astonishing for the time. At the same time, the Iberian Peninsula was experiencing its own profound transformation. For centuries, the Christian kingdoms had fought against the Moorish rulers, a process known as the Reconquista. At the end of the 15th century, this long struggle was about to be completed with the fall of Granada. Out of this centuries-long conflict, the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal emerged as united, militarily hardened, and deeply religious nations. The belief that they had been chosen to carry Catholicism into the world was deeply rooted in their national identity. This missionary zeal, paired with an insatiable hunger for gold and glory, created an explosive mixture of motivations. In the minds of Europeans at that time, the world was a place made up of three known continents: Europe, Africa, and Asia. These landmasses were surrounded by the world ocean, an ocean of mystery, fear, and legends. In educated circles, people did know that the Earth was a sphere. The myth that everyone believed in a flat Earth is a later invention. But they had no idea of its true size. The maps of that time were a mixture of accurate surveys of known coastlines and fantastic depictions of sea monsters and mythical islands in the unknown vastness of the Atlantic, the Sea of Darkness. This was the European world. Dynamic, driven by greed and faith, technologically advanced enough to dare great voyages, and desperate, searching for a way to bypass the Ottoman blockade. And, on the other side of this ocean, there existed a completely different humanity. A vast double continent, from the icy expanses of the north to the stormy tip of the south, populated by hundreds of different cultures and millions of people. A world that had existed in complete isolation from the Eurasian and African world since its ancestors had come across a land bridge from Asia to Alaska more than 15,000 years earlier. In Central America, in the region we know today as Mexico, stood the mighty empire of the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world at that time, larger than any European city except perhaps Constantinople or Paris. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, it was a marvel of engineering, crossed by canals, causeways, and floating gardens, the chinampas, which fed the enormous population. In the center of the city rose massive pyramids and temples, on which complex and often bloody religious rituals were performed to appease the gods and maintain the balance of the cosmos. Aztec society was highly stratified, with an emperor at the top, a priestly and warrior caste, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. They had a precise calendar system, pictorial writing, and a deep understanding of astronomy and mathematics. Farther south, along the rugged Andes mountain range of South America, stretched the empire of the Inca. It was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, a tightly organized state held together by an ingenious road system some thousands of kilometers long. Relay runners could transmit messages across the enormous distances of the empire at astonishing speed. The Inca were masters of stonework. Their buildings, such as Machu Picchu, fit into the dramatic mountain landscape with incredible precision and without visible joints. They practiced highly developed terrace farming in order to grow maize and potatoes on the steep slopes of the Andes. Instead of writing, they used a complex system of knotted cords, the quipus, to record data and information. At the head of their empire stood the Sapa Inca, who was revered as a direct descendant of the sun god Inti. But these two great empires were only the tip of the iceberg. North America was a mosaic of countless different cultures. In the Mississippi Valley, the people of the Mississippian culture had built impressive earthen pyramids and large urban centers such as Cahokia, a city that may have had 20,000 inhabitants at its peak. In the northeast, the tribes of the Iroquois League formed a powerful political confederacy. On the wide plains of the Great Plains lived nomadic peoples whose lives revolved around the bison hunt. On the Pacific coast in the northwest, cultures such as the Haida and the Tlingit created artistic totem poles and plank houses from the wood of the giant cedars. What all these American cultures had in common was their deep spiritual connection to the land and to nature. Their religions, their myths, and their daily lives were inseparably woven together with the world around them. They had domesticated plants that were completely unknown in Europe: maize, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, pumpkins, cacao, and tobacco. However, they had none of the large domestic animals of the Old World. There were no horses, no cattle, no pigs, and no sheep. The wheel was used as a toy, but not for transportation. And crucially, they knew no weapons made of iron or steel. Their sharpest blades were made of obsidian, a volcanic glass. And what was perhaps the most tragic difference of all? Because of their thousands of years of isolation, their bodies had developed no immunity to the diseases that had long been rampant in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and had become part of everyday reality. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. These were the two worlds in the late 15th century, each one rich in history, culture, and knowledge. Each one a complete universe of human experience. And both stood, without knowing it, on the threshold of the most dramatic and consequential collision in human history. The story of the discovery of America is almost always linked to one person and one voyage. But the historical truth is more complex and reaches farther back. Long before the Spanish caravel set sail, another group of European seafarers had crossed the Atlantic and set foot on the North American continent. They were the Norsemen, better known as Vikings. Their saga is a story of extraordinary courage, seafaring skill, and the tireless urge to look beyond the horizon. Around the 10th century, about 500 years before Columbus, these Scandinavian seafarers had already settled Iceland, a harsh volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic. From there, a particularly daring man named Eric the Red pushed even farther west. He had been exiled from Iceland because of manslaughter and sailed in search of new land. He found it, a huge ice-covered island, which he cleverly named Greenland in order to attract settlers. And indeed, people followed him. They founded small settlements on the southwest coast of Greenland and lived there for several centuries, from hunting and livestock breeding, in a constant hard struggle against the elements. But the story did not end in Greenland. Eric's son, Leif Erikson, was seized by the same desire for discovery as his father. According to accounts in the Icelandic sagas, Leif heard from another seafarer named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had gone off course on his way to Greenland and had sighted an unknown wooded land in the west without going ashore. Fascinated by this story, Leif bought Bjarni's ship around the beginning of the 11th century and set out with a crew of about 35 men to find this mysterious land. He sailed west and followed the traces of Bjarni's involuntary journey in reverse. The sagas describe how they first reached a land of flat stones and glaciers, which they called Helluland, land of flat stones, probably present-day Baffin Island. They sailed farther south and came to a wooded coast, which they named Markland, forest land, probably corresponding to the coast of Labrador. Finally, they reached an even more inviting region. They found a place with milder winters, rivers full of salmon, and meadows that were lush and green. Especially remarkable were the wild grapevines that grew there, which led Leif to give the land the name Vinland, wine land. Here in Vinland, Leif and his men built a small settlement in order to spend the winter. They built several longhouses from turf and wood and explored the surrounding area. This was the first unquestionable physical contact between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of North America, but since the original settlement of the continent thousands of years earlier. The sagas call the indigenous people Skraelings, a term that probably included ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, as well as the Beothuk peoples. The first encounters were probably a mixture of curiosity and mistrust. At first, trade took place. The Norsemen offered milk and red cloth in exchange for furs. But the fragile understanding did not last long. Cultural misunderstandings and the violent nature of the Vikings quickly led to conflicts. The technological superiority of the Vikings, with their iron axes and swords, stood against the numerical superiority and better local knowledge of the indigenous people. After several violent clashes, in which there were deaths on both sides, it became clear to the Norsemen that a permanent settlement under these hostile conditions would be impossible. After only a few years, the Vikings abandoned their settlement in Vinland and withdrew to Greenland. Although there may have been isolated voyages to Markland in the following years to obtain wood, no serious attempt at colonization was ever made again. For a long time, these stories from the Icelandic sagas were dismissed as pure myths and legends. But in the middle of the 20th century, the Norwegian research team Helge Ingstad and Anstein Ingstad made a sensational discovery. At the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a place called Lance O's Meadows, they excavated the remains of a Norse settlement, the foundations of several turf longhouses, a smithy in which iron had been worked, and artifacts that were clearly of Scandinavian origin. Radiocarbon dating confirmed that the settlement dated from around the beginning of the 11th century. It was undeniable archaeological proof. Vinland was real. Why then did this first discovery have no lasting consequences? Why did the rest of Europe know nothing about it 500 years later? The reasons are many-layered. First, the Vikings were a relatively small population group. The settlements in Greenland were small and isolated and were themselves struggling for survival. They lacked the resources and manpower for large-scale overseas colonization. Second, there was no strong economic incentive. Vinland offered wood and some furs, but no immeasurable riches such as gold or spices, which would later drive the Spaniards. Third, there was no state support. The Viking voyages were private ventures by individual chieftains, not expeditions financed by powerful kingdoms. And finally, knowledge of Vinland was never widely spread. It remained within the oral tradition and the handwritten sagas of Scandinavia, and was forgotten in the rest of Europe. Even the Norse settlements in Greenland were abandoned during the 15th century because of a worsening climate, the so-called Little Ice Age, and possibly conflicts with the Inuit. The connection to the West broke off completely. The voyage of the Vikings, therefore, remains a fascinating historical footnote. It proves that crossing the Atlantic was possible long before this unnecessary technology was considered mature. But it was an echo in the silence, a discovery without consequences for world history. The curtain fell again, and the two worlds slept for another 5 centuries, separated by the ocean. The next contact, however, would not be so quiet, and it would not be so without consequences. In the late 15th century, a man stepped onto the stage of history whose name would forever be linked with the connection of the two worlds: Christopher Columbus. He was not a king, not a prince, but the son of a weaver from the Italian port city of Genoa. Yet he possessed an unshakable belief in himself, a burning ambition, and an idea that most experts of his time dismissed as absurd. Columbus was an experienced sailor. He had sailed on Genoese merchant ships in the Mediterranean, had traveled along the coasts of Africa on Portuguese expeditions, and had lived for a time on the island of Madeira. He was a man who knew and understood the ocean, but he was also self-taught, a tireless reader of geographical texts, travel reports, and the Bible. His great idea was basically simple. Instead of searching for the long and dangerous route around Africa or overland to the east in order to reach India and China, he wanted to take the direct route west. He knew, like all educated people of his time, that the earth was a sphere. Logically, then, if one sailed west long enough, one would eventually arrive in the east. The plan was bold, but not new. The question was not whether one could reach Asia that way, but how far it was. And this was exactly where Columbus's decisive mistake lay, a mistake of monumental proportions that, ironically, would lead to his greatest triumph. Based on his own faulty calculation and a selective reading of ancient and contemporary geographers, he came to the conclusion that the Earth was significantly smaller than it actually is. He underestimated the circumference of the planet by roughly 25%. In addition, he assumed that the Asian continent extended much farther east than it actually did. The result of this double miscalculation was that he believed the distance from the Canary Islands to the coast of Japan was only about 2,400 nautical miles. The actual distance is more than 10,000. According to his map, between Europe and Asia, there lay only a manageable ocean. He had no idea that an entire double continent lay in the way. With this plan in mind, Columbus searched for a sponsor. His first point of contact was the most obvious one: the King of Portugal. Portugal was the leading seafaring nation of the time, but Portuguese experts examined his calculations and rejected them. They knew better. Their own experience along the African coast had given them a much more accurate picture of the size of the earth. In their eyes, Columbus's plan was not bold, but suicidal. No ship of the time could carry provisions for such a long voyage. Undeterred, Columbus turned to Portugal's rivals, the Spanish monarchs Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Here, too, he initially met with rejection. Spain was fully focused on the final campaign of the Reconquista against the Moorish Emirate of Granada. A commission of scholars at the University of Salamanca dealt with his proposal for years and came to a similar conclusion as the Portuguese. The distance was too great. Columbus spent almost a decade promoting his idea at the courts of Europe. He was on the verge of going to France when the tide turned. At the beginning of the year 1492, Granada fell, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. The Reconquista was complete. Isabella and Ferdinand were at the height of their power and prestige. They now had their hands free and were more determined than ever to compete with their Portuguese rival in the race for the riches of Asia. In this atmosphere of triumph and national pride, Columbus's persistent campaigning finally found a hearing. Perhaps it was a mixture of the desire to outdo Portugal, missionary zeal to win new souls for Christianity, and the relatively small investment for the chance of immeasurable profit. They agreed. Columbus received the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea, was appointed Viceroy and Governor of all the lands he discovered, and was promised 10% of all revenues from those territories. It was an unbelievably generous contract. 3 ships were placed at his disposal for his expedition, the Santa Maria, a larger and somewhat cumbersome flagship, and two smaller, more maneuverable caravels, the Pinta and the Nina. The crew consisted of about 90 men, a mixture of experienced sailors, some adventurers, and also some petty criminals who had been promised a pardon for taking part in the dangerous voyage. In the late summer of 1492, the small fleet put to sea from the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera. They first sailed to the Canary Islands, which were already under Spanish control, in order to carry out final repairs and take fresh supplies on board. From there, in early autumn, the real journey into the unknown began. Columbus was a brilliant navigator. He used the steady trade winds that drove him swiftly westward. But the days turned into weeks, and no land was in sight. The mood on board became increasingly tense. The sailors were far from any known coast, farther than any European ship had ever been before on the open sea. Fear of the unknown, fear that the winds would never bring them back home, and fear that the calculations of their Italian admiral were wrong after all, gnawed at them. The initial hope gave way to mistrust and fear. Columbus kept two logbooks, a secret one in which he recorded the actual distance traveled, and a public one in which he deliberately entered shorter distances so as not to alarm the crew. But even this trick could not contain the growing unrest. After more than a month at sea, when they had long passed the point at which Columbus had expected to arrive in Asia, the fleet was on the brink of mutiny. The men demanded that they turn back. Columbus asked for only 3 more days. If they did not find land during that time, he promised they would return. It was a desperate gamble for time. But then the signs began to multiply. They saw birds that were not known as deep-sea birds. They fished a branch out of the water that had clearly been worked by human hands. Hope began to rise again. In the deep night, after more than 30 days on the open ocean, a sailor in the lookout of the Pinta cried out the liberating words, "Tierra, tierra, land, land." In the first light of dawn, they saw it clearly before them. A low green island lined with white sandy beaches. On a day in the autumn of 1492, Christopher Columbus rowed ashore. He fell to his knees, kissed the ground, and took possession of the island in the name of the Spanish crown. He raised the royal flag and named the islands San Salvador, Holy Savior. He was firmly convinced that he had landed on the edge of Asia, on one of the offshore islands of India. For this reason, he called the people who came curiously out of the forests to watch the strange arrivals, Indians. For the people who lived there, the Taino people, this day was the beginning of the end of their world. They saw great ships with huge white wings, men with pale skin and beards, dressed in strange fabrics and shining metal. They carried weapons that spat fire and thunder. It must have been a sight of unimaginable strangeness, like beings from another world. The Taino were a peaceful people. They received the strangers kindly, offering them water, food, and gifts. Columbus noted in his logbook their gentleness and their apparent simplicity. But he also noticed the small gold ornaments they wore, and this small detail would seal the fate of millions. From then on, the search for gold would be the driving force. Columbus continued sailing through the island world of the Caribbean, discovered Cuba, which he believed to be part of the Chinese mainland, and Hispaniola, today the island shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Everywhere he searched for the great cities and the legendary riches of the Great Khan of China, about which Marco Polo had written. He did not find them. Instead, he found more friendly tribes, lush vegetation, and again, small amounts of gold. On Hispaniola, the expedition suffered a setback. The flagship, the Santa Maria, ran onto a reef and had to be abandoned. From the remains of the ship, Columbus had a small fort built, La Navidad, the first European settlement in the New World since the Vikings. He left about 40 men behind with the order to search for the source of the gold and set out with the 2 remaining caravels on the return journey to Spain. The return voyage was stormy and dangerous, but in the spring of 1493, he reached the port of Palos again. His arrival was a sensation. He brought with him several indigenous people whom he had captured, along with exotic parrots, unknown plants, and, most importantly, small amounts of gold. He presented his finds to the royal couple and proclaimed that he had found the western route to India. Europe was electrified. Columbus became a hero overnight. His faulty geography was accepted as fact. The alleged success of his voyage unleashed a wave of excitement and envy throughout Europe. The door to the West had been pushed open. But at that time, no one suspected that it was not the door to the old riches of Asia, but the gate to a new world. And no one suspected the price that the inhabitants of that world would pay for this discovery. The men he had left behind at La Navidad, as he had to discover on his second voyage, had been killed by the Taino because of their greed and brutality. It was a dark omen of what was to come. The collision of worlds had begun. Columbus's second voyage, only 1 year after his triumphant return, was no longer a small mission of discovery. It was a massive fleet of colonization and conquest, 17 ships loaded with more than 200 people, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and farmers. They brought horses, pigs, cattle, goats, wheat, sugarcane, and an invisible but deadly cargo, the pathogens of the Old World. This was the beginning of what historians today call the Columbian Exchange. It was the largest and most consequential exchange of living beings in the history of the planet. From the Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa traveled plants that would forever change the kitchens and agriculture of the Old World. The potato from the Andes became a staple food in many parts of Europe and helped fight famines. Maize became an important feed crop. Tomatoes, originally from the Andes but cultivated in Central America, revolutionized Italian cuisine. Peppers, beans, pumpkins, peanuts, avocados, pineapples, and vanilla began their journey across the Atlantic. And 2 products would have a special global impact: cacao and tobacco. In the other direction, from the Old World to the New, the exchange was just as dramatic. Wheat and grapevines allowed the Europeans to grow their familiar foods. The introduction of domestic animals was revolutionary. Horses, which had been extinct in the Americas since the Ice Age, fundamentally changed warfare, hunting, and transportation for the indigenous peoples of the plains. Cattle and sheep led to livestock farming according to the European model, and changed the landscape through grazing. Pigs, which multiplied quickly and ate almost anything, became an important source of food, but they also often devastated the fields of the indigenous people. Yet, the most devastating part of this exchange was biological and unintended. Without knowing it, the Europeans brought an army of invisible killers with them. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, the bubonic plague, and typhus had raged in the Old World for centuries. Over time, European populations had developed a certain genetic resistance, and immunity. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, whose ancestors had reached the continent long before these diseases became major epidemics, these pathogens were completely new. They had no defenses at all. The result was a demographic catastrophe of unimaginable scale, the Great Devastation. When smallpox first broke out on Hispaniola, it wiped out a large part of the Taino population within a very short time. From there, the epidemic spread like wildfire through the trade routes and social networks of the indigenous peoples, often faster than the Europeans themselves. Entire villages were wiped out before they had even seen a European. According to estimates, in the decades and centuries after first contact, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died. That means tens of millions of people. It was the greatest human tragedy that had ever occurred. Societies collapsed. Knowledge was lost forever, and the balance of power shifted tragically in favor of the European invaders. While diseases carried out their silent, deadly work, the violent conquest began. Driven by gold, land, and the conversion of the heathens, the Spaniards established the encomienda system on Hispaniola. Indigenous communities were entrusted to individual Spanish colonists, the encomenderos. In exchange for protection and Christian instruction, the indigenous people were supposed to provide tribute and labor. In practice, it was little more than brutal slavery. People were worked to death in mines and on plantations. The combination of forced labor, malnutrition, and imported diseases led to the almost complete extermination of the original population of the Caribbean islands within a few decades. This brutality did not go without opposition. Some priests, such as the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who had himself once been an encomendero, became horrified witnesses to the suffering. He devoted his life to fighting for the rights of the indigenous people and wrote shocking reports about the atrocities of the conquistadors. His writings led to major debates in Spain about the nature of the indigenous people and the legality of the conquest. Were they fully human beings with souls? Or were they, as others argued, natural slaves? Although laws were passed to protect the indigenous people, they were hardly enforceable in the distant colonies. The realization that the coasts Columbus had found were not Asia, but a new world, slowly began to spread. Another Italian, in the service, first of Spain and then of Portugal, Amerigo Vespucci, explored the coast of South America and came to the conclusion that it must be a new continent. A German cartographer, Martin Waldseemüller, was so impressed by Vespucci's writings that in 1507 he named the new continent America in honor of Vespucci on a new world map. The name stuck. With the knowledge of a new continent, the focus shifted from the search for a sea route to the exploitation of this land itself. Rumors of legendary golden empires in the interior of the continent fired the imagination of a new generation of adventurers and conquerors, the conquistadors. These were often impoverished nobles, veterans of the Reconquista, who saw no future for themselves in Spain. They were ruthless, brave to the point of recklessness, and obsessed with the search for gold, glory, and God. In the early 16th century, one such conquistador, Hernán Cortés, led a small expedition from Cuba to the mainland, present-day Mexico. He had only about 500 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. His target was the mighty Aztec Empire, of whose immeasurable wealth he had heard. What followed is one of the most incredible and brutal stories of conquest in history. Cortés used a mixture of military violence, cunning, and diplomacy that was almost without equal. When he landed on the coast of present-day Veracruz, he did not encounter the feared warriors of the Mexica, but the Totonacs, a people suffering under the oppressive rule of the Aztecs. He quickly recognized that the Aztec Empire was not a monolithic block, but a fragile structure held together by fear. Many conquered peoples hated the rule of the Mexica, their relentless demands for tribute in the form of goods, and, what was most feared, human beings for their sacrificial rituals. The Totonacs complained about the Aztec tax collectors, who demanded not only their harvest, but also their sons and daughters. Here the political genius of Cortés became clear. He promised the Totonacs liberation and protection, and encouraged them to arrest the Aztec officials. At the same time, he secretly sent a message to the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II, in which he presented himself as a friend and arranged the release of the officials in order to ingratiate himself with the central power. He played both sides against each other, sowed discord, and presented himself as a powerful new actor on the political stage. To cement his own position and to crush any thought of returning to Cuba, he made a dramatic decision. He had his own ships destroyed. With this act of creating a fait accompli, there was no way back for his men. Their fate was now inseparably tied to the fate of Mexico. They had to win or die. With his new Totonac allies, Cortés marched inland. His path inevitably led him into the territory of the Tlaxcalans, the bitterest enemies of the Aztecs. The Tlaxcalans were a proud and warlike people who had preserved their independence for generations in constant flower wars against the overwhelming empire. They had no illusions about the Spaniards and saw in them only new invaders. A series of brutal battles followed. The small Spanish force, although technologically superior, with its steel blades, crossbows, and the shocking effect of its cavalry, was nearly overwhelmed by the sheer mass of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. For days, they fought desperately for survival. But their resilience and the deadly efficiency of their weapons left a deep impression on the Tlaxcalans. Finally, the elders of Tlaxcala came to the conclusion that these foreign warriors must be invincible. They recognized in Cortés the ultimate weapon against their hated Aztec neighbors. After weeks of fighting, bitter hostility became a decisive alliance. The Tlaxcalans provided Cortés not only with food and shelter, but also with tens of thousands of their best warriors. Without this alliance, the conquest of Mexico would have been unthinkable. The march continued to Cholula, a large city and an important religious center that was loyal to the Aztecs. Here, according to warnings from his Tlaxcalan allies and his indigenous translator and lover Malinche, the Cholulans were planning an ambush. Cortés decided on a preemptive strike of horrifying brutality. He had the nobles and priests of the city gather in the main square and then gave his men and the Tlaxcalan warriors the signal to attack. In an hours-long slaughter, thousands of unarmed Cholulans were massacred. The massacre of Cholchula sent a shockwave through the entire empire. It was an unmistakable message. Resistance against these foreigners would be punished with merciless annihilation. Now the road to Tenochtitlan lay open. The Aztec ruler Moctezuma II, a deeply religious man tormented by dark omens, received the Spaniards hesitantly. The arrival of these bearded, light-skinned men in shining armor, who rode on deer-like beasts and controlled thunder and lightning fit in a disturbing way with old prophecies about the return of the god Quetzalcoatl. Moctezuma chose the path of diplomacy and appeasement. He allowed the Spaniards to enter the magnificent capital, a city that left the conquistadors in unbelieving amazement. They saw enormous causeways leading across the lake, a metropolis crossed by canals, with floating gardens and a huge, pulsating marketplace. It was a vision that exceeded their boldest dreams of wealth and civilization. But Cortés had not come to marvel. He had come to conquer. In a daring move, he took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace under a pretext. The godlike ruler of the Aztecs became a prisoner in his own golden cage. Cortés tried to control the empire through his puppet emperor, had enormous amounts of gold handed over to him, and forced Moctezuma to publicly declare himself a vassal of the Spanish king. The elite was paralyzed, caught between loyalty to their ruler and growing hatred of the arrogant intruders. The situation escalated when Cortés had to leave the city to confront a rival Spanish expedition on the coast. He left part of his men behind under the command of the impulsive Pedro de Alvarado. During an important religious festival, the Toxcatl festival, Alvarado lost his nerve. Convinced that the dancing, unarmed Aztec nobles were planning an uprising, he ordered a massacre in the great temple. Hundreds were slaughtered. This was the spark that caused the powder keg to explode. The population of Tenochtitlan rose up in a furious rebellion. When Cortés returned, he found his men besieged and the city in a state of open war. In a desperate attempt to calm the crowd, Moctezuma was forced to appear on a palace balcony. But he was attacked by his own people with a shower of stones and died shortly afterward from his injuries. The situation of the Spaniards was hopeless. On a rainy night, they tried to flee the city. Loaded with gold and jewels, they were attacked on the causeways by thousands of Aztec warriors in canoes. The escape became a catastrophe. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies were killed, drowned under the weight of their gold, or were captured to be sacrificed on the pyramids. This night entered Spanish history as La Noche Triste, the sad night. But Cortés did not give up. He withdrew to Tlaxcala, where his allies gave him refuge and rebuilt his army. He understood that Tenochtitlan could not be defeated by a frontal assault, but only by a siege. In a logistical masterpiece, he had a fleet of 13 small warships, brigantines, built in parts and carried over the mountains to Lake Texcoco by thousands of indigenous porters. Meanwhile, his deadliest invisible ally struck. A devastating smallpox epidemic, brought in by the Spaniards, broke out in the densely populated besieged city. The Aztecs, who had no immunity at all, died by the tens of thousands. The disease killed a large part of the population and the warriors, including the new emperor, and deeply demoralized the survivors. With his new fleet controlling the lake and with a huge army of indigenous allies, Cortés began the months-long brutal siege. He cut off the water and food supply. His men and allies fought their way slowly, causeway by causeway, house by house, into the city. The Aztecs, led by their last heroic emperor Cuauhtémoc, offered bitter resistance. But against Spanish tactics, technological superiority, and the devastating epidemic, they had no chance. In the late summer of 1521, after months of hunger and fighting, the once magnificent city of Tenochtitlan finally fell into rubble and ashes. On its ruins, the Spaniards built Mexico City, the capital of their new viceroyalty of New Spain. A decade later, this pattern of boldness, betrayal, and overwhelming violence was repeated in an even more dramatic way in South America. Francisco Pizarro, another conquistador, older, even more ruthless, and unlike the educated Cortés, illiterate, set out with an even smaller force of fewer than 200 men to conquer the vast Inca Empire. He too arrived at a politically favorable moment. The empire had only just emerged from a devastating civil war. Two brothers, the sons of the deceased emperor, Huascas and Atahualpa, had fought for the throne. Atahualpa had defeated and captured his brother and was on his way to the capital, Cusco, to consolidate his rule. The empire was united, but deeply wounded and exhausted. Pizarro led his tiny band of adventurers into the heart of the empire. Atahualpa, informed by his scouts about the small number of foreigners, completely underestimated them. He agreed to a meeting in the city of Cajamarca, convinced that he could easily capture the strange intruders. Pizarro, however, planned one of the boldest and most treacherous ambushes in military history. He hid his cavalry and his few cannons and harquebuses in the buildings around the large empty square of Cajamarca. Atahualpa entered the city with a huge, magnificent procession of several thousand of his best warriors and courtiers. They were, however, only lightly armed, because it was meant to be a ceremonial display of his power. In the square, only the priest Vicente de Valverde, with an interpreter, stepped forward to meet him. The priest began to read the requerimiento and demanded that the Inca ruler submit to the Christian God and the Spanish king, while holding out to him a breviary or a Bible. Atahualpa, who felt the incomprehensible insult, asked where the priest took this authority from. When the priest pointed to the book, Atahualpa took it, looked at it briefly, and then contemptuously threw it to the ground. This was the signal Pizarro had been waiting for. "Santiago!" he cried, and the trap snapped shut. The cannons thundered. The harquebusiers fired their volleys into the dense crowd. Then the armored horsemen stormed out of their hiding places, a wave of steel and screaming horses striking at the panicked, unarmed crowd. For the Inca, who had never seen horses or firearms before, it was pure terror. The attack was short, but absolutely devastating. In the shortest time, thousands of Inca nobles and warriors were massacred without a single Spaniard being killed. In the middle of the slaughter, Pizarro's men threw themselves upon the emperor's golden litter and captured Atahualpa. Without their godlike ruler, the tightly organized Inca Empire was leaderless and paralyzed. Atahualpa, now Pizarro's prisoner, recognized the Spaniards' insatiable greed for gold. He made an incredible offer to buy his freedom. He promised to fill the room in which he was being held, a room about 7 by 5 meters, once up to the height of an outstretched arm with gold, and the same room twice with silver. Pizarro agreed. For months, unimaginable treasures poured into Cajamarca from across the whole empire. Temples were plundered and palaces emptied in order to gather the ransom. It was probably the greatest accumulation of precious metals in one place in history. After the room was filled and the ransom was paid, the Spaniards broke their word. They had no intention of releasing the powerful emperor, who could become a rallying point for resistance. They staged a show trial and accused Atahualpa of crimes such as usurpation, idolatry, incest, and treason. He was sentenced to death at the stake. In his final moments, Believing that the burning of his body would deny him an afterlife, Atahualpa agreed to be baptized. Thereupon, the punishment was mercifully changed to death by garrote, a strangling device. With Atahualpa's death, the backbone of the Inca Empire was broken. Pizarro marched to Cusco, plundered the immeasurable treasures of the capital, and installed a puppet ruler in order to maintain the appearance of continuity. Although there were repeated uprisings and bitter resistance in the following decades, the fate of the empire was sealed. The immeasurable gold and silver treasures of the Inca were melted down, cast into bars, and shipped to Europe, where they would change the economy of the continent forever. The fall of the Aztec and Inca empires was therefore more than just a military defeat. It was the collapse of entire civilizations made possible by a fatal combination of European ruthlessness, superior military technology, the devastating effect of imported diseases, and the brilliant but diabolical exploitation of internal divisions by the conquistadors. The Spaniards destroyed temples, burned sacred writings, and did everything they could to erase the old religions and cultures and replace them with Christianity and Spanish rule. To understand the mentality that made this ruthless conquest possible, we must look deeper into the psyche of the conquistador. These men were products of late 15th and early 16th century Greece, a society shaped by the centuries-long struggle of the Reconquista against the Muslim Moors. This constant war had created a culture of militant Christianity and a deep belief in their own religious and cultural superiority. In their eyes, the conquest of the Americas was a direct continuation of this sacred mission. The indigenous people were, like the Muslims and Jews before them, the others, heathens who had either to be converted or subjugated. This conviction manifested itself in one of the strangest and most revealing rituals of the Spanish conquest, the requerimiento, the requirement. This was a legal document that the conquistadors were obliged to read aloud to indigenous peoples before an attack. In this text, often read in Spanish or Latin, and from a safe distance to people who did not understand a single word, the history of the world according to Christian teaching was explained. The authority of the Pope was set out, and the rule of the Spanish crown over these new lands was proclaimed. The indigenous people were ordered to recognize this authority and convert to Christianity. If they refused, which was inevitable because of the language barrier, the requerimiento declared them guilty rebels. The violence, enslavement, and dispossession that followed were therefore, from the Spanish point of view, a lawful and just war. It was a grotesque spectacle that provided the conquistadors with a theological and legal alibi for their actions and tragically symbolized the deep gulf of understanding between the two worlds. It showed a mentality that was capable of exercising extreme violence while at the same time believing in its own formal and divine justification. The Columbian exchange had developed from an exchange into brutal subjugation. The new world was to be reshaped in the image of the old, and the price for that was the almost complete destruction of the worlds that had existed there for thousands of years.